Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm Jeff Howe, joined by CJ Vogel. Time for this week's edition of Longhorn Weekly. It's brought to you by Flat Creek Estate Winery. We'll tell you more about Flat Creek here in just a little bit. CJ, let's start off with recruiting. That's going to be the bulk of what we talk about today. Things have not been going the Longhorns' way on the recruiting trail. We know that. There's no sense in beating the dead horse. But you had an interesting piece over on ontexasfootball.com on Monday morning looking at some of the flips Texas has had under Sark later in the cycle. I think that should drive home the point, CJ, of for fans to survive this without losing it, especially if you're new to following recruiting, you gotta balance it out. Yes, you can feel bad about the losses right now, but understand there's a long way to go before this recruiting cycle gets put to bed and games to be played in the fall. And Jerry's pointed it out. You've pointed it out. We've all pointed it out here on the channel, whether it's Malachi Lee or any of the other prospects that Texas has lost recently, some of them, James Johnson, another one. There are guys that Texas is going to recruit through the whistle regardless of their decisions in the summer.
Yeah, 100%. It's pretty interesting, looking back at the month of June and kind of the highs and lows in which recruiting takes you through during a given cycle. Texas still earned 7 commitments in the month of June. Now, that's a pretty good month given and taken what Texas was able to land, right? A trio of talented defensive linemen, a 5-star Richard Wesley, which I don't think anybody was truly expecting for him to make that decision on his official visit June 22nd. So, look, there's some big wins in there, though. We got to be real about it, right? That back end of the month of June, those final 3 or 4 days, didn't leave a great taste in your mouth, right? And there's a point I want to make about recruiting and the way that in which Texas has been in over the last cycle or two and will continue to move in over the next however long Texas remains nationally competitive. When you miss out on a consecutive string of recruitments, in this era, it's always going to feel more significant because you're recruiting a higher level of athlete. You're recruiting a more prominent figure on the recruiting rankings across the country, right? Where are these guys going? Michigan, Georgia, Alabama, Florida. They're going to big-time programs across the country in which Texas, it's not like they're losing them to Oklahoma. It's not like they're losing them to TCU or Texas Tech or Oklahoma State, right? They're losing them to nationally prominent figures across the country. So, yeah, a bit of a tough stretch, right? Texas over its last 6 and guys that that made decisions towards the back end of June, but it's hard to get guys from Hawaii. It's hard to get guys from Miami. It's hard to get guys from Alabama to not end up at Alabama, and that's where Texas is recruiting. So, yes, it feels like a lull. Yes, it feels like a drought, but how often do you see Texas land guys from Hawaii, from Alabama, who want to go to Alabama, from Miami, right? That's part of the recruiting world. It's just kind of become watered down because of the success on the field, the NIL package that Texas can pair with its recruiting now. But it'll turn around in July, that's for sure.
CJ, there's 2 specific cycles I want to look at because the 2022 flips, they're all out of the program. Kelvin Banks and Cam Williams are off to the NFL. Xavier Bryce and Terrence Brooks transferred out. And with the 2024 flips, we saw Ty Anthony Smith a little bit last year, and I'm really excited for his future, what he can do as a modern day off-ball linebacker. And I know you're very bullish on Wardell Mack. We've gone over that here on the channel a lot, and I'm sure you'll continue waving the Wardell Mack flag for everybody leading up to camp. But the 2023 and 2025 flips, CJ, where would the present of this roster be without Anthony Hill, Jelani McDonald, DeAndre Moore, Colton Vasek, and Warren Roberson, who sneakily had a really good spring out at corner? And then you talk about the future of the program. It doesn't get much bigger than the 2025 flips when you're talking about Cade Phillips, Dalen McCutcheon, Myron Charles, Josiah Sharma, and Grayson Littleton. And Phillips and Littleton, Roberson, all 3 of those guys are in the mix at corner, either to get some reps from Manny Muhammad or to take that spot opposite of him. Just goes to show you, CJ, the flips that Texas has gotten, if they're a big-time prospects that they really like, they'll stay on them. And 2, with guys like Grayson Littleton, they'll continue to evaluate. And if there are guys that pop up late in the process that they really like, they won't be afraid to throw their hat in the ring.
100%. Texas will continue to hang around the rim. I know that phrase been thrown around pretty often, but all of these commitments that you mentioned probably happened middle of November, into signing day, right? That little window late in the year in which these guys were previously committed elsewhere, normally right around this time of the year, late June or June, early July, they make their decisions elsewhere. Yet Texas sticks around. And it's funny you mentioned those cornerbacks. Look, add Xavier and Bryson, add Terrence Brooks to that group as well. That's really where Terry Joseph made all of his push, was in that late cycle. Now Mark Orfe orchestrating things a little bit differently. Texas set to at least be in the contention for Samari Matthews over the next couple of days. But point being, the effort in which Texas views top targets on its board won't disappear because of a commitment elsewhere right now. And Sarkisian mentioned it best last year. Hey, talk to me in December. We don't need to discuss rankings. We don't need to discuss class personnel, anything like that in June or July. I'm not going to fret over things right now. And Texas fans, I think, are very much of that same mindset. Just let's get to where we are when we need to be in December. And I'll even throw this out. How big, looking back, was that flip of DeAndre Moore from Louisville? Because that 23 class, I know Colton Fossick was one of the big ones, flipping from Oklahoma, staying in Austin. Anthony Hill, obviously, flipping from Texas A&M. How different would things be if he was on that A&M defense and Texas had a void at that spot a year ago? And obviously, Jelani McDonald. I mean, we're all talking about him as a true breakout, but one of the more underappreciated flips in this Texas recruiting era has been DeAndre Moore. And I'll end it with this, Jeff. Texas, in its consistency of having the same head coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and strength coach, that means a whole lot. Because look at where Texas has been able to poach a lot of these guys. You look at Cristobal in 2022 taking the Miami job. Well, now you just got 2 NFL offensive tackles as a result. Florida firing Corey Raymond, the all-world defensive coordinator, defensive backs coach, who ended up at LSU. Texas was able to get Xavier Filsaime and Wardell Mack from that cycle. Florida State going 2-10 a year ago. Well, there's Myron Charles and Dalen McCutcheon. So Texas and its consistency at the head coaching position and below, that helps them retain their big class and also pitch to others trying to get into the class. We got something good going on in Austin.
Good stuff, CJ. We'll get to the current week's decisions here in just a second. But right now, want to thank our sponsor here for this edition of Longhorn Weekly. That's Flat Creek Estate Winery. Flat Creek has been such an awesome sponsor, an awesome partner here at On Texas Football. Did you know that the most awarded wine in Texas is actually the vineyard closest to Austin? That's right. Flat Creek Estate Winery is just minutes from town, and they've won award after award for their vintage wine, the Super Texan. And congratulations is in order to Flat Creek Estate. The Super Texan recently won the San Francisco Wine Award with a score of 98 out of 100. It was named the top red blend in the country. Not just the best red blend in Texas, it's the best in the country. The Super Texan and other Flat Creek Estate wines are now available at Specs and HEBs across the state. Of course, Flat Creek is also a gorgeous venue with barbecues and wine tastings every single weekend. Perfect for a day date with your significant other. Again, big thank you to Flat Creek for their sponsorship and their support of On Texas Football. That's Flat Creek Estate Winery. A lot of members of the On Texas Football family taking advantage of what they've got going on out there and heading out there. So again, big thank you to Flat Creek for their sponsorship of On Texas Football and Longhorn Weekly. CJ, let's go ahead and get the graphic up. What's on tap for this week? And it's going to start on Wednesday. A big day. Kendall Graville, the big defensive lineman out of Fort Myers, Florida, makes his decision. Trenton Henderson, the very talented edge prospect from Pensacola, makes his decision. We'll get to a couple of the other ones, but let's start there, CJ. As we start the week out, Texas, from all indications, are still leads for Kendall Graville. Texas playing catch up with Florida for Trenton Henderson. As we sit here right now, CJ, is that still the way you see it?
Yeah, Texas and Kendall Graville feel like a marriage that's just ready to basically kiss the bride, right? It's right there. They're at the podium. You know, the teary-eyed families are sitting there waiting for approval. All that's left to be done is the ring on the finger, essentially. And that one, for me, feels like it's still trending in the right direction. Now, LSU is the school to watch for me with Trenton Henderson. Florida's also in that race. Obviously, Texas and Alan Clark hosted him June 20th. Alan Clark was actually the coach to pick him up from the airport. Nice Texas welcome there. But LSU seems to be pushing very hard with its NIL package for Trenton Henderson. And look, we talk about Florida being in a lot of these recruitments. They're also not winning a lot of these recruitments. Kendall Gerville would be a big hit for them. James Johnson previously was a big hit for them. If Trenton Henderson ends up outside of Gainesville, look, that's a pretty significant blow. But moving on into that July 4th decision date, and look, July 4th haven't been too friendly for the Texas Longhorns recently. Bryce Perry Wright and Clemson feel like they're headed in the right direction, but I still feel like Texas is the team to beat for John Turntine. In fact, I've said, Jeff, I would be very surprised if John Turntine did not end up being a Texas Longhorn. I've typically always had a recruit that I would put my job on the line, sort of say, and say, I would find a different profession if X recruit did not end up at Texas. John Turntine's close to that conversation at the moment, only 5 days to go before his decision. So we'll see. Of course, that would be a big win for the Longhorns, adding to its offensive line classification. But at wide receiver, I still think there's work to be done with Caden Finley and Jalen Lott. Of course, Caden Finley, Notre Dame's been a big threat there, and USC has been the school to beat for about a month now with Jalen Lott. We'll see if Texas is able to make some late movement there with about a week to go for each.
Yeah, next Tuesday will be Jalen Lott, and that'll kickstart, as far as the scheduled announcements, that'll kickstart the action next week. I want to go back to Kosi Akpala, the linebacker from Katy Matey Creek, who's going to decide on Thursday. Come back to him in just a second, but let's go back to July 4th, CJ. I don't think I need to say anything else about John Turnstine. He's been probably the top offensive line target on the board for Texas, at the top, if not the top, for Kyle Flood in this cycle. Bryce Perry Wright, CJ, again, we talked about it here on the channel. It really seemed like when Richard Wesley committed to Texas, that kind of cured the need Texas had for a guy like Bryce Perry Wright. Not that they've completely stopped recruiting him, but getting Richard Wesley, CJ, it cushion whatever blow Texas might have felt had they lost Bryce Perry Wright. I think they're okay there as far as that quote-unquote strong side in kind of 5-tech type guy that could play multiple shades out on the edge.
I think you're absolutely right. And look, I think Texas liked Bryce Perry Wright. I think Bryce Perry Wright liked Texas. He made unofficial visits to Texas about 4 times, even prior to his final official to the Longhorns. With that said, the addition of Richard Wesley, I think, was the true green light from the Texas staff, saying this spot is yours and yours first, given kind of the way that these decisions fell in place with timelines, etc. So the Longhorns earning that commitment from Richard Wesley certainly negates any of the downfall or otherwise uncertainty at the edge position with Bryce Perry. Right now, what's going to be really interesting is how does a Trenton Henderson decision, either for or not for Texas, impact that of Jamarian Carlton, who decides July 10th. Right now, Baylor's perceived to be the biggest threat outside of the Longhorns in that one, and things actually trending in a pretty positive direction for the Baylor Bears at the moment. We'll see if that changes in the week after July 2nd and Trenton Henderson going into July 10th.
CJ, let's get to Caden Finley. We talked about this decision, and I know we've said it here on various shows on this platform, but Notre Dame has not only been putting up a heck of a fight, they're in it to win it with Caden Finley. Things trending the Irish's way, CJ. So let's assume right now that Texas misses out on Caden Finley and Jalen Lott next Tuesday. Let's assume both those, Finley goes to Notre Dame, and for Jalen Lott, it's USC or Oregon. What for you is the balance between understanding that Texas missed on their 2 top wide receiver targets in this cycle, but when you look at what's on campus right now, if Texas can keep the 2025 wide receiver signing class in place and no attrition, when you're talking about Dalen McCutcheon, Jamie French, Khalik Lockett, Michael Terry, assuming Texas can keep those guys in the fold, does that cushion the blow for you a little bit, the fact that Texas could come up relatively empty? No disrespect to Cohen Brown and Chris Stewart, but they're going to miss on the other guys at the top of their board. Does that cushion the blow for you a little bit, knowing what Texas has in the pipeline already?
Perhaps. I mean, again, Texas has a really talented, group of 4 at the wide receiver spot from a year ago. We'll debate later what the overall ending position is for Michael Terry. I still think it's going to be wide receiver. But point is, you've got a pretty talented room with a lot of bodies, and that's something that Texas has kind of struggled with. We talk about defensive line wanting to go big class. Wide receiver, they needed a big class with a number of guys either headed off to the NFL draft or a number of guys not panning out to the way that we had previously hoped in previous cycles. So, look, it lessens the blow, but it's still significant because I do think Caden Finley is very talented, and I think you and I both mentioned it previously plenty. Jalen Lott's my favorite recruit in this cycle, with just the way that he's able to explode down the field and ultimately just out jump folks for the football. So it is significant. You do have two talented guys, Chris Stewart, Cohen Brown, in the class. But does that set up a run at a big guy later on down the road? Could Texas make a bigger push for Jabari Mack during the season? Does Texas get back involved with the Tristan Keys? I think that's going to be interesting. Aaron Gregory has previously said that his recruitment shut down, but I think we all agree that, hey, a Steve Sarkisian offense versus that of a Colin Klein, I don't think it compares that all that closely. So we'll see, of course, what Texas has been able to do in recent years. And again, look, a miss on a Micah Hudson netted you a Ryan Wingo, and I think Texas fans would be taking that trade 10 times out of 10, given how things have panned out over the last 18 months.
Yeah, our colleague Rod Baber says it all the time, and I'm a firm believer, whether you're talking about the high school ranks, the transfer portal, the NFL draft, wide receiver is the deepest position in football, and you can find some really good players that aren't necessarily top of the food chain type guys, even though I don't want to pour salt in the wound, but I've said watching Jalen Lott at wide receiver, I get some Dez Bryant vibes with just the freaky, violent twitch Jalen Lott plays with. So we'll see what happens on the wide receiver front. But CJ, I want to go back to Kosi Okpala from Katy Matey Creek. And if you listen to Sark on Third and Longhorn, the great interview he did with Rod and Company, that interview was done a while back, but it dropped last week. If you listen to Sark talk about position flex and position versatility and multiplicity on defense, Kosi Okpala fits that mold. He's an off-ball linebacker, but you watch the tape and you see there is some natural pass rush ability, the ability to play on the edge. Not to say this is going to completely make up for missing out on Xavier Griffin going to Alabama, but if Texas lands Kosi Okpala, he very much fits what Texas is looking for right now in an outside linebacker.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. We always talk about, or at least I always kind of go back to what other schools are kind of prioritizing skill sets. For a while it was, if TCU is recruiting a defensive back and you haven't offered, you probably should be interested.
Yep.
Right. And I look at edge rushers / kind of those hybrid linebackers in Penn State recently saying, oh, if they are prioritizing that kid, you're probably in on the right level of pass rusher hybrid linebacker. And Kosi Okpala certainly fits that mold. I'm not going to say he's going to go be a Micah Parsons, but I do think that they value and have a pretty good eye at what those positions ultimately turn into, or what those prospects ultimately turn into. So, yeah, he kind of gets lost by the wayside because Texas recruited 5 linebackers in the month of June, brought them in for official visits, all 5 of which in the top national 250. Kosi Okpala is a pretty darn good football player, and I'd be, again, a little bit surprised if he ended up outside of Texas, given his upcoming decision. Again, he made back-to-back unofficial visits to Texas in the month of April. You don't do that unless you have really high interest in a school. At the time, I kind of thought that maybe something would pop then. But, hey, with that decision coming up this week, I'm looking at Texas and Okpala saying, yeah, that one makes a lot of sense.
And, CJ, if you look at the 3 battles where Texas has the best chance to close on some commitments this week, you're talking about offensive tackle, you're talking about interior defensive line, and you're talking about a pass rush presence on the edge. Again, that's kind of the theme for this 2026 recruiting class. I'm going to put you on the spot, CJ. Of these announcements this week, which ones right now as we sit here and record this do you feel are going to go Texas' way?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, one that Texas fans are certainly waiting to hear more good news about. I look at the top 2 on the first and second column. Look, Kendall Gerville, John Turntine, I think that they are headed to Texas. I also think the guy that we just mentioned, Kosi Okpala, look, that's going to be 3 over the next week, and we'll see if Texas is able to make a splash at the tight end spot later on. And I think that race for Samari Matthews out of Huff, North Carolina, I think that's pretty close. South Carolina, Miami also in the mix there. Clemson is completely out. But Texas has been prioritizing Samari Matthews, and if they're able to land him, look, I think you just about put a bow on your cornerback recruitment for the class of 2026. And if you're Mark Orfe right now, you just went 2 for 2, perhaps even 3 for 3 on your top cornerback targets if you include Jermaine Bishop, given a potential addition of Smoke Matthews to the Texas 2026 class.
CJ, let's switch gears real quick as we wrap this up and talk some baseball transfer portal. I know that's kind of a few miles away to go from football recruiting, but let's go baseball transfer portal. Easton Winfield and Bryce Navarre both enter the transfer portal Monday morning. Blake Monroe's got some notes and some intel on those decisions at ontexasfootball.com. But CJ, as of right now, barring something unforeseen, I think this is the last of the outgoing attrition that we're going to see from the 2025 Texas roster. We know Schloss and company have to wait out the draft in a couple of weeks, and we'll see what else they can add. But right now, CJ, when you look at the losses, which ones stand out to you as guys maybe you wish things had panned out differently or that you would have liked to have seen return for Texas in 2026?
Yeah, I think we're looking at Easton Winfield here. I had some pretty high hopes for him a year ago. Obviously thought, given what we knew about his time previously at ULM, what he was coming in with, the way that he was already pegged to be the guy in left field to begin the season, I thought that was going to be a bit more significant of a loss if he didn't turn out favorably for the Longhorns. But Texas has approached the portal with such aggression at the outfield position that I'm just sitting here saying, I don't know how much of a loss it will be. I will say younger arms with a high upside, a lot of velocity, that like a Bryce Navarre, that stands out more to me. And I know Texas has been able to add some really key arms, especially towards the back end of their bullpen through the portal this offseason. But you always kind of hold out hope for guys that come in throwing 94, 95, 96, right? You didn't see a whole lot out of Navarre this year, right? He had an 8 ERA in about 6 appearances. But again, I'm a sucker for that velocity, Jeff, especially at a young age. I think that's going to be the more significant loss that Texas has seen out of the portal this year.
Yeah, that's why I was interested to see what a guy like Aiden Moffitt could have done with one more year with Max Wiener. But it sounds like maybe Aiden Moffitt has gotten some draft assurances, which is why he's hit the portal / going to take his chances in the draft. And, we talk about the outfield mix. I really wish things had worked out differently between Texas and Will Gasparino, but it is what it is. It's not it's just unfortunate, CJ, the way things played out on that front. But to your point about Easton Winfield, we've talked about it. I do like the course correction, if you will, that Schloss and the staff have made, where the bats they targeted in the portal, guys that have a multi-year track record of success hitting at the Division I level, whether you're talking about Maroknik or Robbins or Freeman, these are guys that have done it for multiple years. That's got to make you feel on top. I know you're a big on-base percentage guy, CJ. On top of that, you got to like the fact that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Carson Tenney, the bats that they've added are guys that have multiple year track records of getting it done.
Yeah, look, I'm a sucker for OPS, on-base percentage as well. But look, the point is, and it doesn't always equate apples to apples here, but when you add 4 guys with more doubles than your leading double getter a year ago, more home runs than your leading home run hitter a year ago, more RBI than what your leading RBI leader had a year ago, you're getting a guy with a lot of production. And when you do that 3 or 4 different times, now you're looking at a lineup thinking, well, this might be really darn good, right? These guys are used to big moments and delivering in those instances and those at bats. So I think when you look at the way that Texas kind of targeted a lot of its portal addition so far, it's been precision in the way that they've gone out after guys with power, the ability to get on base, and even some guys that are able to stretch in, singles to doubles, doubles to triples, singles stolen base into doubles. Those guys mean a whole lot more, and especially against some of these SEC level pitchers, Jeff. Well, those strikeout numbers can't be as high as they were a year ago. And when contact is made with the guys that Texas brought in, those balls are hitting the wall a little bit more often than what we saw a year ago.
And quick shout out to Trey Johnson, goes to the Washington Wizards in the NBA draft and their Texas lottery pick, goes number 6 overall. CJ, I love what he said when they had the introductory press conference with Trey and Jameer Watkins and Will Riley, and they're asking him about the jersey numbers they chose. Trey's going to wear 12, and Jameer Watkins and Will Riley gave really thought-out answers. Trey's answer, quote, I just kind of stared at the list and seeing which one grew on me, which is why he's switching from 20 to 12. So I think Wizards fans are going to love Trey Johnson. I'm going to love watching Trey Johnson in the NBA. CJ, I haven't had a reason to watch Washington Wizards basketball maybe ever in my life, but I do now. So congrats to Trey Johnson for making that happen.
He's certainly going to have his shot opportunities there as well.
All right, CJ, thank you for the knowledge and expertise as always. Thank you to Matthew behind the scenes for producing it and the entire On Texas football staff. Big thank you to Flat Creek Estate Winery for sponsoring this edition of Longhorn Weekly and for being such a great partner for us here at On Texas Football. If you need up to the second information on what's going on in recruiting, the baseball portal, football offseason, whatever it is, get over to ontexasfootball.com, but come in OTFOG today. You could do that by signing up using the promo code OTFOG. That'll get you 1 year of access at ontexasfootball.com for $39.95. You're not going to want to miss anything. Look, we know this run in recruiting announcements is almost over, the big summer recruiting wave, but we got Big 12 Media Days coming up before too long. We've got the Texas High School Coaches Association Convention. Then right after that, we'll be into camp. Football, actual real football will be here before you know it. So get over to ontexasfootball.com. You don't want to miss any of it. Use the promo code OTFOG, and that'll get you 1 year of access for $39.95. For CJ Vogel, I'm Jeff Howe. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And until next time, welcome.